It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Rick Potts. Rick is Director of the Human Origins Program and Curator of Anthropology at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, where he holds the Peter Buck Chair. He is the curator of the David H. Cook Hall of Human Origins at the Smithsonian, and he authored the companion book to the exhibit in the hall called What Does It Mean to Be Human? Rick studies the interplay of environmental change and human evolution, a field that he pioneered. He's done seminal fieldwork on this in Kenya and China, and recently he and his team working at the Rift Valley in Kenya obtained the first drill core covering 500,000 years of climate history from a site of early human habitation. In addition to his appointment to the Peter Buck Chair at the Smithsonian, Rick is the recipient of the Lowell Thomas Medal of the Explorers Club, and he is a AAAS Fellow. He has been the Darwin Lecturer at the University of Kentucky, the Stigler Lecturer at the University of Arkansas, the Wigand Lecturer at the University of Toronto, and he has received 2 Emmy Award Certificates of Honor for his work on television documentaries on human evolution. He earned a BS at Temple and a PhD at Harvard. He taught at Yale before joining the Smithsonian in 1985. He is an author on more than 125 publications. He is also a Phillies fan, and this is very notable for us at the PSW because the Phillies are the oldest continuous one-name, one-city professional franchise in American sports, founded in 1883, just 12 years after PSW. Rick's talk is entitled Drilling for Human Origins, Understanding Climate's Influence on Human Evolution. And I now turn the podium over to Rick.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank Larry for his kind introduction and to the members of the Society who hosted me for dinner, and I only hope I can make my own talk as digestible. And I also really appreciate Larry's support and persistence in having me come to to speak with you tonight and to have a chance to be with you, and especially for the part of his introduction where he did not mention that the Philadelphia Phillies are the losingest franchise in sports in the world. So I do appreciate that. I wanted to take you on a journey through time, and also to my summer home, which is here in the Rift Valley of southern Kenya in the eastern part of Africa, and the unpronounceable name of the field site, Olorgesailie, is how it's pronounced, in Maasai country in the southern Kenya Rift Valley. It's a spectacular place to. I've spent about nearly a quarter of my adult life working here, digging holes, finding fossils, encouraging colleagues to join me on the quest to understand the time journey, the immense journey of our own species, and uncovering evidence of our evolutionary history. And you can see that it is quite a layer cake of exposed outcrops of sediments. The northern part of the Olorgesailie Basin, which you see here, has been dissected by rivers and streams and wind, and allowing us to see these amazing outcrops that allow us to put together the last 1.2 million years of time in the place that is often called the cradle of mankind, but I refer to it more as the cauldron of humanity because of the evidence of roiling events and churning process that define the line between survival and decline in the evolution of populations that were either closely related to us or perhaps even ancestral to our species, Homo sapiens. And so I'll come back to this in a moment, but first let's step back for a moment and get a little bit of an overview about human origins. I don't know if many of you have been to the Hall of Human Origins that opened in March of 2010 in the Natural History Museum. That was, for me, a 20-year gestation of giving birth to that hall, but working with a remarkable group ultimately of exhibit designers and scientists from around the world, objects from 48 different countries, and writing the institutions in those countries to get their encouragement and support and specimens was probably the largest curatorial challenge I had in developing that hall, but it was very worthwhile, I feel. This is one of the main points of the exhibit is that it didn't happen all at once, that the complexity of who we are today as a species was built up over a long period of time. And so, for example, going back a 6 million year history, but we have, for example, just in this slide, the bipedal footprints that go back to 3.6 million years that Mary Leakey's team discovered in northern Tanzania at the site of Laetoli, where 3 individuals walked across an East African landscape during a time of rain, where the rain fell down on the volcanic landscape, and basically a carbonatite volcano that led to the ash that was deposited on this floor. When you mix water and carbonatite, you get essentially cement. And that's why these footprints, not only these, but those of the whole ecosystem of organisms, is represented in this particular floor, back, as I say, to about 3.6 million years. Just with these 5 skulls, you see the representing about 2.5 million years of time. You see changes in the size of the brain case and also in the size of the face. A very simple exercise of just portraying the change over time that occurred through the fossil record. The number of fossil individuals that are known pertinent to the last 6 million years, that is of our own evolutionary history, is about 6,000 individuals, which is not bad for a fairly large vertebrate. But in addition to that, we have the remarkable record of hundreds of thousands of archaeological sites that also indicate aspects of the behavior, the adaptations, the ways of life, and the interactions with environments that our ancestors and relatives also undertook. We have also 2.6 million years of technology represented right here, of Stone Age technology from very, very simple flaking of choppers, and also then that goes back to about 2.6 million years. About 1.75 million years ago, the development of hand axes, building on top of the basic core tools that continued on. But then toward the end of the story, evidence of innovation. These are the oldest sewing needles known in the world. They come from China. They're about 32,000 years old. And then, of course, the explosion of symbolic behavior, the evidence of the symbolic worlds in which we make for ourselves and that all cultures develop as a way of passing on culture, passing on beliefs, developing the worlds of imagination through which we filter reality. And, of course, the ability to create abstraction about the world. Now, there have been lots of icons of evolution. This one is incorrect. This is probably the most famous illustration by which many people identify with the concept of evolution. It's an old concept. It's a 19th century. It's representing a 19th century concept of evolution as progress with some kind of inevitability with modern humans. At the end of it, the march through time of a single line of progress. And perhaps you've seen many, many different ways in which this has been used in television advertisements, in concert tours for rock groups, all sorts of things. This one happens to be my favorite, where apparently it leads to perfection in a glass of Guinness beer. But there are many, and perhaps you have some of your favorites where you've seen it as well. But the tree of human evolution is quite different, and what I'd like to do is just take you through a series of steps of million-year intervals, back to, well, let me just start back up here again, to 5 to 6 million years ago, which is kind of a time of mystery in our evolutionary origin. The scientists are still exploring this time period where there are fossils known from Kenya and Ethiopia and also Chad in north central Africa, where there are fossils that indicate an ape that there was evidence of right posture. One of the very first aspects of that define human beings as unique, our evolutionary ancestors as unique from all other primates, the evolutionary group to which we belong. But then you go through time and you have a variety of species that begin to develop. This one, a famed skeleton named Artie. 3 to 4 million years ago, you have another famed skeleton called Lucy, and this is the lineage of Australopithecus afarensis. You then have 2 to 3 million years ago, the division of our evolutionary tree into the large-toothed and the large-brained forms, our evolutionary tree, who gave rise to us. You then have the emergence of the first early human to go outside of Africa, to disperse out of Africa. And then in the last 1 million years ago, you have still a quite diverse evolutionary tree, including the origin not only of our species, but also the origin of Neanderthals from a common ancestor, most likely Homo heidelbergensis, known in Europe and in Africa, where the European populations gave rise to Neanderthals, and the African populations, at least the hypothesis is, then gave rise to Homo sapiens. But you also have the last remaining populations of Homo erectus that had been around for a long time, as well as this very curious laboratory of evolutionary experimentation on the island of Flores in Indonesia, in which these small early humans known as Homo floresiensis, affectionately known as the hobbit of human evolution, has been found. And so you have a branching and diverse tree, which is one of the major founding discoveries that has resulted from the subject in the study of human evolution, especially over the last 40 to 50 years. A line of progress through time, but a tree much like that of most other organisms in the history of life on Earth, organisms or an evolutionary tree that is branching and diverse with quite a bit of extinction. And we'll get back to that at the end of the talk. Another icon of evolution, for those of us who are deeply involved in it, and this is an idea that does go back to Darwin's Descent of Man, published in 1871, is what's known as the savanna hypothesis. And the savanna hypothesis is basically the idea that what differentiated human ancestors from other primates, from other ape common ancestors, was the fact that those that became the ancestors of human beings found in a relatively open environment, possibly a grassland, where there was drying through time, and that it was this setting. All you had to do was place those populations out in this setting, and that created the basic dilemma or challenge of human evolution. And once you had that in place, the rest just simply unfolded through time, whereby one adaptation builds upon another, the drama of human evolution occurring on this relatively stable stage of the African savanna, later on moving to a stage of Ice Age Europe and Asia. But basically you have a drying and cooling environment, a fairly simple environmental picture. in which you have walking upright, tool making, expanded diet, all the things that you see here from up to complex social life and language occurring over time, but in a fairly quick manner. This made sense when the timeline of human evolution was largely confined to about 500,000 years or perhaps 1 million years, which is thought to be the case up to about 1960. But then with the advent of new radiometric dating techniques, the time period of human evolution ultimately was initially moved back to 2 million years ago in the early 1960s, and then 3 million years ago in the early 1970s, and now it's understood as being approximately a 6 million year process. Since the 6 to 8 million year process, really, since the division from a common ancestor, not any living ape today, but a common ancestor between those who became us, or led to us, and those who led to other African apes. And that's, of course, something that is well borne out by the study of DNA and the genetics that give a signal of the relationship, not only the relationship of you to your families and to all people around the earth, but also the relationship of our species to all other species as part of the grand venture of the history of life on Earth. And so I began to doubt that particular icon of evolution, that is the savanna hypothesis, when in 1985 I began work in the South Kenya Rift at that site called Olorgesailie. And while I went there for other research reasons with regard to uncovering fossils, I quickly became more of a geologist, of anything, or a person who connected the geological realm of environmental change to the subject of paleoanthropology. And so the basic question that quickly developed in the research there was, how did early humans adjust to environmental change of the past 1 million years? You go to hillsides in this basin, this sedimentary basin. It's in the Rift Valley, so the Rift Valley being a valley, it has these bowls filled up with sediment over time, but because it's the Great Rift Valley of East Africa, it's also tectonically active, lots of earthquake activity, faults that move the landscape up and down. And so after a period of about 700,000 years of sediments piling up over time, you had about 500,000 years ago uplift. And that began a process of cutting through the northern part of the basin, revealing the sediments. Sometimes there would be filling back up of some of those valleys that had been cut out, and then further erosion. And we're now in a cycle today, and over the last approximately 50,000 years of erosion. And that's what allows us to, as paleoanthropologists, to go out and find things. Nature does the first excavation. It carves out these, through these ancient layers. We just stumble along and find things, and then we help nature out a little bit by excavations. And we have about 300 geological trenches in this particular basin that helps us put together the record of landscapes and landscape change through time, and helps us to understand something about ancient climates, especially up to about 500,000 years ago. We also have, for example, another hillside sliced through time. In this particular example, this is a hillside where there's a date of about 1 million years at the bottom of it, and the whole hillside represents about 10,000 years of time. And I just want to show you some of the first evidence that I saw when I walked up this hillside back in 1985 and again in 1986. Put some geological trenches in there, and essentially this is what we saw, for example, just in this particular area, is that through isotopic techniques of studying stable carbon isotopes, we can tell matters of the vegetation from studies of other things like diatoms, the lake diatoms that tell us about the chemistry of the lake and the depth of the lake, that we could reconstruct a picture actually quite early on in this research that led to this sort of zigzag line back and forth between wet and dry, wet and dry. And it struck me that as I looked at this and I thought, okay, I'm going to be studying what happened as early humans adapted to the ancient savanna. And I used environment as a single noun, not a plural noun, that I realized there's a heck of a lot of change going on here, and what's that all about? And so I basically retooled over the next several years into studying environmental science. And this is one of the iconic diagrams of environmental science that is obtained by the study of the tiny organisms known as foraminifera that occur in deep sea cores. And the forams live in the ocean, and as they die, they pile up on the ocean floor, and ships go out, and they put big drill rigs up there, and they drill down, and they get cores out. And these can be studied in the forams, in this particular case, microorganisms that build their microscopic tests, their skeletons, out of calcium carbonate, and from the study of the isotopes of oxygen, O16 compared with O18, and the change in it, it is a record of temperature and glacial ice through time. In this particular case, starting with 10 million years over here to the present over here. And these are records that can be traced back and have been pieced together back to 70 million years. But I just wanted to show you the 10 million year time period. And basically what you see is that starting at around 6 million years ago, the range of environmental fluctuation per half a million, or rather per, half a million years or per a million years worth of time, begins to ramp up, and that climate fluctuation between warm and cold becomes more dramatic over time, and you can see that here. We have the start of glacial fluctuations around 3 million years ago, 2.8 to 3 million years ago in the higher latitudes, the development of glacial ice, but then retreat of glacial ice, so these cold-warm cycles. And then what we have when you're looking at it from the standpoint of a paleoanthropologist is that the genus Homo, the genus to which we belong, as in Homo sapiens, our species name, the genus Homo evolved during the strong fluctuations. And so that led me to think, now, is it the overall trend that's important, the overall cooling of the Earth in Africa, the overall drying out of the continent that's important? Or is the stuff that many environmental scientists, and especially evolutionary biologists studying human evolution, thought as just noise, the noise actually be more important as a signal that could drive adaptive change? And I began to think about this, and I began to reframe the concept of our evolutionary and environmental adaptations in terms of the variability, the environmental dynamics, rather than just the stable environment or the overall trend. So I began to look at many other environmental records with the help of many colleagues who understand these records better than I do. And so, for example, the sapropel record obtained usually by deep sea drilling in the eastern Mediterranean Sea, which those particular cores are representative of the flooding of the Nile catchment, which represents the northeast quarter of the African continent, including East Africa, where the Nile originates, and the Nile flow originates. And this happens to be a slide on the northern side of the Mediterranean in Italy, where there has been uplift of these sediments, so that you can see them more easily. And you can see that there are these dark bands and light bands, and these dark bands and light bands can be studied. The dark bands represent times of major monsoonal rainfall that then cycle through to times that are lighter bands of drought. And it just happens to be that the darker bands are filled with organic material that is part of the flushing out from river systems that end up in the Mediterranean and cause these organic blooms to occur. And the light bands are times when the rainfall is much much, much less. And so you could begin to see this, and you could see that there were actually, or I could see with the help of my colleagues, that when I presented this idea of stability and instability, that this is something that actually represents for Africa, for much of tropical and subtropical Africa, as well as the overall Mediterranean, maybe a more important record for us to be aware of. Not just the overall trend, not just the overall increase or ramping up of variability over time, but you could actually see evidence of times of where the sediments stay relatively stable, and then times when there's much more instability. How could we measure this? And so we were very much concerned about that. Well, let me just explain why we thought that this matter of instability would be a very important thing to study. And many of you have heard of this before, Milankovitch cycles, what they're called, the ways in which Earth's orbit changes. This is a bit of a simplification, but essentially the shape of the Earth's orbit around the sun is called eccentricity, going from a more oval or a more eccentric orbit to a less eccentric orbit, back and forth, on a time period of about 100,000 years, and with another periodicity at about 413,000 years. And the other one that's important for tropical Africa, tropical and subtropical Africa, is not the Earth's tilt in the axis of rotation, but rather what's called orbital precession, the wobble in the Earth's axis of rotation. And it turns out that precession, when modulated, when it's affected by eccentricity, leads to some very interesting predictive framework. And so a number of us played around with that, and over the last year I've presented this to geological audiences and to the environmental community as a new model for understanding and predicting climate variability over time. And so tropical African climate is strongly influenced by variation in the amount of insolation, solar radiation hitting the planet. In fact, all climate is affected by that. But in tropical Africa, there's two main factors, and I just mentioned those, and that's the interaction of orbital precession, which occurs on these two cycles, and eccentricity, which occurs on these two cycles. And that when you do that, the interaction between essentially these four sine waves gives you a pattern of alternating high and low climate variability in tropical Africa. And so to show this in a kind of a graphical form is that you take the cycles of precession, only one of them shown here, not both of them, and the two cycles of eccentricity, 1.5 million years ago to 0, just as an example to show here. And you see this sort of period of higher variability, predicted higher climate variability, and the lower climate variability that is controlled by what's called the precession index. That is this interaction between these particular Milankovitch cycles. And so does this help us understand the empirical record of climate variability? And it turns out that it does. It actually has helped a lot with understanding the long stratigraphic sequences within the East African Rift Valley, showing high periods of high variability in rainfall, lake size fluctuations, and then periods of greater stability. In this particular case, what I've done is taken the sapropel record that I showed you a visual of before, and there's a way of looking at sapropel, the color, spectral reflectance, those black and those light bands. And what you see then is that there is this patterning that can be discerned, especially when you run it through a variety of different statistical techniques of high and low, alternating high and low climate variability. And so this further led me to this idea, is human evolution and evolution in general about adaptation to the environment? And we know this quite well from the basic mathematics of natural selection and lots of evidence from experimental organisms and field studies, biological studies of organisms, that organisms tend to be well matched to a particular environment. But I began wondering whether in this particular situation, should we also consider that in addition to habitat-specific adaptations, that we might also think about adaptation to environmental dynamics And that's when I began to see human evolutionary history not so much as adaptation to the environment, but adaptation to environmental dynamics. And so we might think of it in this way, and let me explain this for a moment. On the left side here, you see past to present, and this is just sort of a general one of those squiggly lines. This is a science of zigzag lines. And in this case, I'm envisioning one, a generalized one between warm and cold and between moist and dry, or some combination thereof. And there are fates of species, of populations or lineages that one could imagine. This is not the best fate, becoming extinct. And what you see here is that these bands represent the amount of adaptive versatility that an organism is able to apply or perhaps even to evolve over time. And the line that runs through them is its ability to follow habitat change. And you can see here this one wasn't doing a very good job of following habitat change. Its adaptive versatility was not very high and it became extinct. The other possible strategy here is for a population or its species to move with climate or other environmental changes, perhaps following a narrow range of diet or survival conditions that it needs for it to thrive. And it is able to move in lockstep with these changes over time and able to maintain its habitat-specific abilities by being able to move. But then I began to think of, well, is there a third possibility whereby there might be actually the ability of adaptability, of adaptive versatility, to evolve over time, to expand this envelope of adaptive versatility over time. And that's what I was envisioning here. It can involve the ability to move, but once adaptive versatility becomes so sufficient, movement across the landscape and across climate zones can occur even independently of climate change, as the ability of the organism to buffer environmental changes grows, expands over time. And so is there a mechanism that would allow that to do that? And so one of the things I did was I postulated a model of what I called variability selection. This was first published in Science in 1996. At the same time as a book that I wrote for a popular audience. It went immediately out of print. This was the basic idea, and it's been developing over time. And basically what we're seeing here is that, again, in a hypothetical climate situation, climate variability situation, that there may be aspects of the gene pool that are favored in specific habitats, perhaps when it's wet, and becomes even more favored when it's wet, and then other ones, other alleles or gene combinations or interactions between the genes that allow the organism to do better in a different kind of environment. But then what I postulated is that back and forth through time, that under certain regimes of temporal changes in variability, that actually what is favored is plasticity. Plasticity at many different levels of the organism, or what at an ecological or behavioral context would be called versatility, adaptive versatility, or the word I tend to prefer these days, adaptability. And so variability selection is a process by which particular combinations of genes are favored. That is, they increase in the gene pool, as we saw in that very simple conceptual model, due to the instability in the survival conditions over time. And the result of this would be adaptations that widen the way in which an organism can interact with the variety of surroundings in which it meets, that enlarges the options available to the organism, the ways in which a species or its species population can use and interact with its surroundings. And so rather than adaptation to any one single ancestral habitat, such as the savanna, what I was postulating here was adaptation to novelty, to adaptation to the variability or to change itself. And that represented, for me at least, quite a different mindset in thinking about human evolution, and perhaps evolution in general, than what I started with when I began the fieldwork in East Africa. And so if this is in fact something that should occur, it should occur not just in humans, but in a whole variety of organisms. And there have been a variety of experiments that have gone in the literature, some of which have tested the variability selection idea explicitly, and others that have been completely independent of that particular idea. And here we have an example from a Arabidopsis, a relative of the mustard plant, and that is one of the pathways to adaptability that was examined and established in a very nice article in Science in 2010, was that alleles at different loci are increased. There are about 100 alleles that affect the adaptability of Arabidopsis in different climates, from warm to cold, and that those alleles at different loci are expressed or suppressed in different environments. And here this suggested that gene regulation should be really quite important. And one thing that we do know about human evolution and the human genome is that gene regulation has been very important in our evolutionary history. When you look at the coding proteins and compare them with that of our closest living biological relative, chimpanzees, that we have only about a 1.2% difference. A very, very small difference. For some organism comparisons, that would be the equivalent of what are called sibling species, species that phenotypically in their outward characteristics look almost exactly the same. And yet the difference between behaviorally, physically, anatomically, all these sorts of ways between humans and chimpanzees is immense. And it's been suggested for many, many decades now that gene regulation has got to be critical to understanding this. There have been a variety of other experiments that have been done that have tested the idea of adaptations to variability itself. One of them that was done in the context of variability selection and testing it was on nematode worms, carried out for a couple of years at Rutgers University. And in C. elegans, that lab populations that encountered temperature extremes at irregular intervals actually ended up becoming better adapted when there were novel temperatures than even those populations of nematodes that were directionally selected toward that novel temperature. So the variability seemed to confer a genetic advantage of some sort, we don't quite understand it yet, to novel environmental conditions. Also in rotifers, there have been some studies in this where related to the development of sexual reproduction in rotifers, where in highly variable and novel environments in space and in time, that sexual reproduction was evolved, but without the loss of asexual reproduction. That was retained and was able to be expressed in homogeneous environments. So it suggests that there is this additive capacity that could evolve over time that could expand that envelope of adaptability that could be tested at least in model organisms. I was trying to, of course, apply it to the most complex organism, and that was my inspiration for presenting the idea. And so adaptability seems to be this important theme, I would suggest to you, in the evolutionary history of life. And with human beings as perhaps being one of the most interesting expressions of that in a complex organism. And by adaptability, I mean the ability of an organism to endure change in the environment, to thrive in novel surroundings, to spread to new habitats, and to respond in new ways to the surroundings. The various literature that has been published about the adaptability of simple organisms seems to indicate these qualities, but look at them. This is characteristic of our genus, the genus Homo, and especially our species, Homo sapiens. And so if we look then at this framework of adaptive variability, of adaptive versatility and responsiveness to evolutionary responsiveness to climate variability, we can then reinterpret some of the founding adaptations in human origin. So for example, the origin of stone tools. It used to be thought of as an adaptation to the ancient savanna. Through these new lenses, many of us would now see stone tools, even these simple ones, as being approaches to environmental change, environmental instability. So you have sharp edges, you have hammerstones, and with those sharp edges you can cut food better than a carnivore's canine tooth, and with those hammerstones you can crush food more effectively than an elephant's molar. And all of this resources, food resources of the savanna open up, and it becomes a kind of buffer to when things change and food resources change. We also see evidence of the spread of our genus, the genus Homo, from Africa to across Asia in this time period, 1.9 to 1.7 million years ago. And it turns out that this is one of the most prolonged periods of high climate variability in Africa, occurring during this time period and that one of the results or one of the correlations of it is the ability to disperse in ways that our ancestors had not before been able to spread across into new habitats. And of course, what is the most plastic and adaptively versatile organ that humans have? Our brains. And I ask, well, what are brains good for? Are they really just ways of solving particular ancestral problems? Or could they be trying to solve, or are brains really good at solving problems when things change, when there is a new situation occurring? And one of the things that neuroscientists have examined a lot more recently is this idea of the connectome, that it's the white matter that really is important in the distinction between human brains and the brains of our closest living ape relatives, such as chimpanzees. And so I have this ear-to-ear slice comparing human to chimpanzee, and a slice that goes across or through the brain from front to back, comparing humans and chimpanzees. And it's really the white matter, the connective tissue, the ways in which the nerve cells communicate with one another that leads to the plasticity of human behavior. The white matter, it integrates neurological and mental processes, and it is disproportionately larger in humans than in other primates. And especially in the prefrontal cortex, there's an immense amount of connectivity that occurs between the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in mediating attention, planning, abstract mental processes, complex social interaction, and it's so highly integrative of other inputs into the brain. And so it seems to me then the brain is also very, very important as a way of looking at this in terms of the adaptive versatility in human beings over time, in human ancestors over time. And so we go back to this, and this is again that iconic diagram of world ocean temperature and glacial ice, this time from 7 million years ago to the present. But remember, we now have a new framework for African human evolution, and much of human evolution has occurred on the African continent, with much of the evidence coming from Eastern Africa. And we now know that there are these long periods of strong wet-dry variability. And so what I've done here is put the 8 longest periods of prolonged instability between wet and dry in East Africa based on that predictive framework. And I thought, well, let me throw against there what we know from the fossil and the archaeological record. What happened, if anything, during these time periods? And when I did that, I was really quite shocked. That the origin, what's known from the fossil record of the first appearance of the genus Australopithecus, the genus Homo, the genus Paranthropus, the large toothed forms in our family tree, and also the origin of Homo sapiens, all occur within a prolonged period of high climate variability. We also have, falling in these time periods, all of the major milestones in technological evolution of the Stone Age, the origin of stone tool making, the Oldowan style of making stone tools, the first hand axes that define the Acheulean, and then the Middle Stone Age, that time period in Africa where we see the beginning of human innovation, occurring after about a million years or more of hand axes, all the way up the stratigraphic column. We also have the first dispersal of Homo occurring, as I mentioned, in one of these prolonged high variability periods, and I didn't have room to add it here, but we have the dispersal of our own species, Homo sapiens, during that last prolonged time period, going from about 360,000 years ago to about 50,000 years ago is the time range of that high climate variability interval. So much has happened during those high climate variability time periods, which suggests that adaptability may be an interesting insight into what we're really talking about when we're talking about human evolution. And so I've been interested, along with a number of colleagues, including John Yellen, who's here in the audience, and Allison Brooks, who teaches at George Washington University, Kay Berensmeyer, geologist, the head geologist who works with us in the field, Alan Dano, who does geological dating, radiometric dating, a whole team in this last time period and what it would look like at Olorgesailie. Actually, sorry, before I go into that, if we put in the times of the major species that are known of Homo, Paranthropus, Australopithecus, and Ardipithecus, we also see that the greatest diversity, the greatest amount of extinction and origination of lineages occurs in this period where there are a number of sort of almost back-to-back long climate variability periods, and also at the end of the story during this prolonged phase of climate variability in Eastern Africa. So let me talk then about, and come to close to a conclusion, about this last time period, and that takes us back to Olorgesailie, where we have been excavating over the last 12 years, not just the period in the hand axe time periods, but into the time period when hand axes became extinct, after about 500,000 years ago. The landscape had become uplifted, but then there were time periods when there was erosion, but then filling. And in those times when the valleys were filling with sediments, we see signs of a distinctly new technology. The hand axes are gone, and we have the beginning of what's called the Middle Stone Age. And so what we have then at Olorgesailie, in fact, I've put back to 1.7 million years ago, which is in East Africa, 1.75 million years ago at the beginning of hand axes. But by about 320,000 years ago, and we are working on publications on this right now, we have the beginning of what look like Middle Stone Age innovations. The large, clunky hand axes are gone. The history of technology has been the same ever since. Things start out really big and clunky, and then they become smaller. We see it in the history of technology in our own time. So there's this transformation to a smaller, more mobile technology. Notice these are 1 centimeter markers up here, a slightly different scale. So this is a smaller toolkit, a more diverse series of toolkits. You have the ability to prepare these cores in really careful ways, such that with one strike of a hammer against this, a wooden or a bone or perhaps even a stone hammer on one end, you then have this occur. You have these points of predictive size and shape that are able to be taken off. And we see this in this time period from starting about 320,000 years ago to 300,000 years ago, and especially well represented by 220,000 years ago, this kind of technology of the production of points. We think that these are small enough that they could only have been things that fly through the air, projectile points. And the history of the world has not been the same ever since. We also have evidence, preliminary evidence of pigments, the accumulation of coloring material. And coloring material is thought to be the founding root of human symbolic behavior. To be able to mark something with a color and somehow to change it, okay? We don't know what they were coloring back then, what they were applying the pigment to, but it is suggestive of the roots of human symbolic behavior, that things we find in the things that people made or accumulated at their archaeological sites began to have a kind of symbolic significance. We also have evidence of long-distance trade through, or exchange of raw materials through the occurrence of obsidian from many tens of kilometers away, which contrasts with the hand axe time period where pretty much all the stone tools were made from rocks you could see, where the outcrops could be seen within 5 kilometers. So a difference, an expansion of the mental maps of these ancestors who had evolved by about 300,000 to 320,000 years ago. And we also have, during the same time period, a turnover in species from where there is these large-bodied grazing animals that become extinct, and we have a modernization of the African fauna. And that's kind of interesting, too. Might there be a relationship between what humans were doing and the effects on these ecosystems, or could the events going on in human evolution be simply correlated with these other sorts of things going on in the biota in general? Really important question for us that we're really trying to scratch our heads about. So this has led to an unusual project. I never thought that I'd be doing this. This is not a launch pad of something going up into space. It's a drill rig. And we have been involved in developing we have led, actually, the first drilling of a long sediment climate core from an early human site. And we drilled to the bottom of the Rift Valley in 2 places. And we have a total of 216 meters of sediment to look at by virtue of this project. Most of our excavations, or all of them pretty much, have occurred in remember, in this eroded area. But when we looked at maps, we have Mount Olorgesailie here. Here is where, with this sediment, this white area is where all the sediment, the outcrops are, in this bird's eye view, this satellite view. But we realized in the Olorgesailie Basin that it extends all the way around the mountain, and that here is a flat plain, and we hypothesized that with uplift of the northern part of the basin, that this then became the depositional center, the new depositional center, starting about 500,000 years ago. And so we thought, let's drill. Let's find out if we're right. Is there a sediment core that we can actually obtain that we couldn't possibly see up here? And in fact, we did. And we did this in September and October of 2012. We got a beautiful, beautiful result from it. This is our workshop. The core is stored in the National Lake Core Facility, which is in Minnesota, the land of lakes, and at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. And we held a core workshop there, or organized a core workshop there for 22 scientists. Now there are about 25, 26 scientists who are working on various analyses of the core. This is showing when we were first splitting the cores open, these cylinders that are about 4 inches in diameter, splitting them open and seeing what they contained for the first time, and the sampling, the careful sampling that was going on. And the basic question is, how did climate dynamics affect the origin of Homo sapiens? I just want to show some of the project members involved in the study of the core. Kay Berensmeyer, whose name I mentioned before, lead project geologist who's describing the core as they're being split open. 2 other members, René Domain from Germany, Bernie Owen from Hong Kong, who are involved here in, as we're studying the core, microscopic studies of diatoms, of phytoliths, those silica bodies that plants make, leaf waxes that have been blown from the terrestrial ecosystem into the lake and preserved in the lake, indicating the kind of vegetation that existed. So many different kinds of charcoal, microscopic charcoal, that will tell us about the intensity and the rate of production of fires on the landscape. All of these different indicators of landscape and ecological change, and also climate change, that we are in the process of studying. Alan Dano, Stephen Rusina, Peter Domenico. Peter is one of the foremost paleoceanographers, paleoclimatologists from studying deep sea cores. He is involved in the studies. Stephen Rusina, who studies fossil pollen, and Al Dano, our good colleague, who provides the geophysical dating of these sediments using the gold standard for East Africa, laser fusion argon-argon, single crystal argon-argon dating. It's a technique that can, through mass spectrometry, date individual volcanic crystals so that you can eliminate contaminants that came from inside the magma chamber as an eruption occurred, and you could find out the age of heating, that is the age of eruption, of one volcanic layer after another after another. And I'm happy to report that in the core, this is just a very small segment of it. These are centimeter markings, okay? And this is a blow-up of this part. This is a blow-up of this part. And this is a volcanic layer. And we have evidence of 150 separate eruptions, all of which can be dated from the last 500,000 years. So we believe that this will be the most precisely dated climate environmental sequence that has ever been obtained anywhere, from ice cores, from anything. And we'll be able to not have just an age model of matching wiggles of prediction, but actual absolute dates. We see evidence of changes from landscapes to times of aquatic lakes. And then these individual varve-like deposits, these individual layers here represent actual seasons, rainy season and dry season. And we'll be able to study this for much of the last 500,000 years and how the seasonality relates to the larger orbital cycles of climate variability that we've predicted should occur in this time period. And then the volcanic ash that I mentioned before. There are many data sets that are being developed. This is one that I can show you right now. It's magnetic susceptibility in the red, gamma radiation in these other dots that are harder to see, from 166 meters to 120 meters of the core. And what we see is this very, very nice cyclicity, and we're pretty certain that these are precessional cycles of wet and dry that we're picking up from this initial data, these initial data sets, and we'll be able to, of course, test this with all these other environmental indicators that we have our scientific team looking at. We have a workshop in November to bring the data for the first time together, to synthesize it and begin statistical analysis of it. And so, as I mentioned, the goal is to look at the environmental conditions associated with the emergence of Homo sapiens, but there are several levels to that question. Number one, between 500 and 300,000 years ago in East Africa, with our excavations at Olorgesailie being the first to really document it, is this transition from hand axe technology to innovative Middle Stone Age behaviors, new toolkits, the use of pigments. We also have, as I mentioned, the modernization of the African fauna, large mammal fauna, that comes from two sites in East Africa where I've excavated, a site called Lenyamok and a site called Olorgesailie, again in that same time period. We have, by 200,000 years ago in East Africa, the first appearance of Homo sapiens. And this is based not only on fossil record, for example, from the southern Ethiopia in the Omo Valley, in the Kibish Formation, fossils dated about 200,000 years ago that are clearly representative of a cranial shape that is Homo sapiens, and even evidence from genomics, from mitochondrial molecular clocks that suggest a coalescence of all human genetic mitochondrial DNA in East Africa at about 200,000 years ago, plus or minus. And we also have, in this time period, evidence, again, from genomics of low population size, either for a prolonged period of time or what some people have suggested is, is a population crash, a genetic bottleneck that reduced human genetic diversity to a very small amount, possibly representing for a prolonged period of time only 10,000 breeding individuals, or perhaps a crash on a much shorter time period that involved maybe, according to some estimates, as few as 600 breeding individuals that led to the emergence of Homo sapiens, the spread throughout Africa, and then the 7+ billion of us who are now all over the place. So we hope to have then an environmental record for East Africa that will be able to put all of these events in context. And so taking from an iconic diagram, a new one from actually from McBrearty, Sally McBrearty and Alison Brooks, two very good colleagues and friends of mine, from 280,000 to 20,000 years ago, we see a whole series of interesting new innovations in human behavior. When things start to become familiar, where things start to become evocative of us, of our own species, even starting before the origin of Homo sapiens at 200,000. I've presented tonight, based on our excavations in southern Kenya, that some of these things will be put back earlier in time, back to 320,000 years ago. And we hope by around the end of the year, if we get writing, we'll actually have our publications out there for the whole world to examine and analyze and see what we found. But I wanted to give you a little bit of the peek behind the curtain tonight at that. And so what does this really represent? This represents increasing innovation, wider social networks with this long-distance exchange, the emergence of complex symbolic activity, and expressions of the human imagination, the world in which we are able to build today, of creativity and imagination. And essentially, as I look at this list, again through the lenses of adaptability that I've now come to look at, our evolutionary history, I see this as a greater capacity to adjust to novelty, to novel environments, including ones that we make for ourselves. And so, could this be part of the cutting edge, the edge that defined the difference between the survival of Homo sapiens and the extinction of these close relatives of ours, these other branches on the human family tree? And what significance should we place on the demise of these earlier species of human ancestors, these relatives and ancestors of ours? Some of them had large brains. All of them had complex social abilities. Some of them could make tools in a refined manner. And some even had the foundations of complex symbolic thought, such as the Neanderthals had some of that. Each lineage had evolved and accumulated or compounded some of the essential ingredients of what it means to be a human today, of what distinguishes Homo sapiens from all other species today. We have in, for example, Homo erectus, a lineage that existed 9 times longer than our own species has been on Earth, and yet it is no longer around. It had basically a limited repertoire of technologies and abilities to interact with the environment, to the point that it became then restricted to Southeast Asia, about 150,000 years ago, where we see the evidence of the last fossils of Homo erectus. With Neanderthals, evolved around the same time as we did, but in Europe, and became kind of the Ice Age specialist, the cool adapted specialist in terms of its body form. And yet it became extinct as Homo sapiens was spreading not only into colder environments than the Neanderthal could stand, but also into warmer, into wetter, and to drier environments than any human ancestor before could have spread into. And so this is why I think of this as a story of adaptability. And so the demise of species in our family tree, I think, causes us to reframe the questions about the fate of our own species in a new way. Are we it? Used to imply progress, a concept of evolution as inevitable, with us as a final product. And yet the more we discover, the more we realize that instead of inevitability, that the theme of adaptability is really the new theme and question in understanding our evolutionary origin. The more we learn, we also realize that the forces of resilience that are important, forces that are not just our individual brains, Homo erectus, Neanderthals, had brains that were quite large, not just our technologies, because they were simple technologies that were successful for a long period of time, but really the entire repertoire of our social and mental tools that we have at our disposal. Our creativity, our potential to care for one another, our capacity to learn about the world, our capacity to not only alter our surroundings, but also ourselves. And I think that these may be the real sources of adaptability that define the new line between thriving and decline in the future of our species. Thanks very much.
Great lecture. Thank you very much, Rick, for a wonderful lecture. Can you hear me? I think we have time for a few questions. Before you ask questions, just a couple of notes. We have 2 people with microphones. If you have a question, raise your hand and wait until you have the mic. And when the mic comes to you, please stand up, tell us your name. If you want to remain anonymous, make a name up. Tell us if you're a guest or you're a member, and then ask your question. So, questions, please.
Hello. So I'm Chris, and I'm wondering, I know it's probably in a different area, but when you're talking about adaptability, it reminds me a lot of agriculture. And I'm wondering if not only if human beings co-evolved with plants, if that's something that you're interested in and have studied, and also did a similar motor for adaptability drive the evolution of grasses and the first plants that we made for our agriculture.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And what's great about this microphone system is I don't have to interpret the question for everyone. So he asked, what's my name? No. A really great question about the origin of agriculture and the intensification of agriculture. And yes, I would certainly say that the emergence of agriculture is an expression of a co-evolutionary relationship, whereby domesticated animals and plants domesticated us as we were domesticating them, creating a greater degree of sedentism. And as a result of that, that what adaptability confers in the evolutionary history of human beings is an ability to surround ourselves with a cultural cocoon. And that cultural cocoon also provided a place of harboring, of safety, of being able to do breeding experiments, of basically taking aspects, a very small aspect of the diversity of those pre-agricultural ecosystems, and change them, and to be able to provide a cocoon that could provide a new environment in which those organisms could evolve, what became domesticated animals could evolve new characteristics. And I think very much that there was a co-evolutionary relationship there. As hunter-gatherers started to plant seeds and tend to wild herds, that there was this back and forth between the reliability of those food supplies, the ability to buffer dearth of resources in the environment, and to provide a safe place for breeding of animals and plants that then became our domesticated life.
Carl Merrill, I'm a member of the society. The way the tree is drawn, the branches appear to be discrete, but we're now getting more and more evidence that there was actually a hanky-panky between some of these species. And so some of the species didn't really die out. In fact, they probably aren't individual species, like Neanderthal. Some of us in this room have quite a few of those genes.
Right. Yes, let me respond to that. I've talked a lot about that with the people who are involved in the Neanderthal Genome Project, for example, the Denisovan Genome Project, and all that. One of the things that's important to understand there, because there's, I think, been a lot of public and through the media misunderstanding of the results of those projects and the evidence of the incorporation of Neanderthal DNA fragments and to some degree some aspects that may be functional in our own genomes, okay? And this occurs for Neanderthals in non-African people. The molecular clock evidence of when that interbreeding occurred is about 60,000 years ago. That is only at the time of the first spread of Homo sapiens into Eurasia. You have overlap then of Homo sapiens and Neanderthals in the Near East for a considerable amount of time and for at least 10 to 15,000 years in Europe, and there is no echo of interbreeding during those times. What this is important, I think what's important to understand is that evolution and divergence of lineages and of individual species is a process. And part of that process is that at times when there is hybridization, that it may not be that successful, but it still may lead to the transfer of DNA from one lineage into another. What's interesting is that Neanderthal genome doesn't show any fragments of modern human Homo sapiens DNA in their genome, but Neanderthals do have some fragments of their DNA in us. And so many of us think that the best way to bring together the fossil record that shows the integrity of Neanderthals as a separate lineage from Homo sapiens is that interbreeding is actually a sign of speciation in process, and which was ultimately successful, leading to different lineages.
Hi, Kenneth Rothschild. I'm a guest. It's sort of two questions. The first is how well do these studies translate into adaptability intragenerationally, not intergenerationally, because things are so accelerated now that the same generation may have to keep adapting while it's alive. Mm-hmm. And the other part may or may not go with this is how difficult is the weeding out process within a species when they go through these changes? You talked about 600 possibly being the base for modern day. In other words, how rough are the changes on the species itself population? Do you have any idea that it goes down 20% or 50% and then comes back?
Right.
Is there anything that
great questions. Let's see, the first part of the question was, sorry, I got so much thinking on the second part was.
The first part is how much can you tell about
intra, right, yeah. Well, one of the things that that a number of us are trying to understand in the relationship to the evolution of adaptability is part of the evolution of adaptability is the emergence of a new capacity for transmitting information, essentially culture. To be able to have a symbolic system that emerges, that becomes so important, that it becomes one of the ways in which people transfer information. And that occurs not only intergenerationally, like genetics, like heredity does, but it also can be across within a generation. And I think that what we're seeing then in the capacity of humans to perhaps outsurvive some of our relatives and the ways of life that disappeared when Homo sapiens emerged from our ancestor is dependent upon a system that is actually successful at all scales of novelty, at all scales of inter and intra-generational variability and challenges to survival. And so I think that we see evidence of that over the last 100,000 years ago, we have this vast increase in cultural diversity, in the variety of ways of being human, of expressing our humanness. That did not occur before. You have much more of a homogeneity of behavior in Neanderthals, certainly in Homo erectus and all the other hominins further back in time. They had their own degree of adaptability, but it's this ratcheting up of adaptability in Homo sapiens that led to the capacity for culture and intra to intergenerational adaptability that I think is a critical part of it. With regard to the matter of weaning, we don't really have any good quantitative way of looking at the depression in earlier species that could have occurred. We have, again, the debates that occur with modern human genetic diversity, where, again, there are these debates that occur, these rigorous debates that occur among geneticists saying that, no, it was for 10,000 years we had 10,000 individuals as the breeding population, and no, in a much shorter period of time we had 600 individuals. Well, to us, we still almost became extinct. But there was some ways in which the adaptability of human beings, of how we were able to put this together, that allowed us to emerge out of that and to spread around the world. I think a critical aspect of it is culture and also our tendency, our proclivity, our brilliance, so to speak, to alter the world. And some of you may think, yes, and that could also be the weak card in our suit as well.
Hi, Bob Jerry, yes, I'm a member. I was just curious, in terms of all this new work with genomics, if you compare and contrast the differences in genomes amongst bits of Neanderthal and us versus Heidelbergensis perhaps, and
Right.
all across these earlier species, how those differences compare and contrast with racial differences that exist today in the genome, and do you think racial divergences are in fact an expression of adaptability, or is it sort of going in the other direction of collapsing the divergence? How
Yeah.
does that stack up?
Yeah, well, with regard to races, the genomics and genetics, now I know some of you may think this is surprising, but we largely see it as a series of clines, of geographic clines, not isolated populations of what people have typically called races. There's lots of human outward variation. But when you look at our genomes, according to the same ways that we can measure it in other organisms, that all human beings today are about 99.9% identical genetically. And that suggests the incredible homogeneity in our genetics. But within that, the variation is the capacity for environmental adaptation, very quick changes that we know can emerge in melanin production and the subtraction of being able to produce melanin with regard to skin color, of changes in physical features. But many of us, from genomics to the study of paleoanthropology, see we're all African under the skin. And we should embrace that. We have this unity of 6 million years of common history relative to the last 60,000 years, a relatively small amount of the diversification and the definition of differences between people. Perhaps we should take the long view of it all and embrace that commonality that all human beings share.
Question?
I'm Rudy Curator. I'm a member of the society, and I sit a head taller than most people in any crowd I'm in, and that's a Neanderthal trait. They had short legs and long torsos. So I think that's the Neanderthal in me. But I'm most interested in the symbolic use of trees to represent things other than trees. And do you have any idea when that began? In my bedtime reading, I've been reading about Gnosticism from the first 3 centuries after AD.
Right.
And they talk about the almond tree
Right.
as the tree of things that are, well, basically they describe it as the tree of life without naming the tree of life.
Right.
So that is a symbolic use of the term tree.
Yes.
And I'd be interested in when that really began to be a notion, because I think it was very important in your talk, and I
Yeah.
think it's been important a long time.
Yeah, artists have talked a lot about my use of trees, particularly that animated one, which I don't control and I have to talk through. Anyway, with regard to trees, certainly with genealogies, and there may be genealogists or people who are more expert in that than I am, but when with the earliest representation of those sorts of things, anthropologists call them kinship diagrams, but you turn it on its upside down and it becomes a tree where time goes up, as opposed to most things that you will see as genealogies where descent actually goes down. That's the root, yeah. And so Scientifically, the earliest one that is of great significance to us in evolutionary biology was Darwin's notebook, which said, "I think." And he wrote, "I think," and he wrote a series of branches coming off. And basically, he didn't understand what he was talking about with regard to, he had no process for the origin of species at that stage when he wrote that in his notebook, but he thought, I cannot see independent invention creation here. I think these organisms are linked, and I want to try to figure it out, and I think, and he drew a tree, or a version of a tree. And so that represents sort of an iconic moment in science for evolutionary biologists of the use of that. But you're absolutely right. The symbolic use of tree to show connectivity goes way, way back.
I think we have one more question. And
Is this on? Hi, I'm Marie. I'm I guess a former member now of the. I was thinking for one thing. Clearly, you didn't get the 6,000-year memo when you were devising a lot of this information. But I wondered about what seems to be an era, or maybe we're merely myopic because we're in it, an era of where so many of these trends that you're talking about are clearly at a gallop. I mean, to the extent that Earth's population, which you claim might have been as low as 600, is now, in my own lifetime, the population of the world has doubled. To the extent that we're, of course, impacting many, including climate, what started out as your sort of primal thesis about temperature variation, and now we're at a point where we can affect that. Are you having to really do you find that your models show that this is sort of a natural extension or evolution of what you see as this very, very long arc of history, this very long trend? Or are you having to sort of readjust your models to accommodate what is clearly a very sort of exotic era in your data collection?
Yeah. The book that I mentioned that quickly went out of print, published in 1996, where I first presented the idea of environmental variability as being a driving force in evolution, including human evolution. I dealt a lot with this matter of, well, yes, but the state of the world today. And I wanted to kind of understand what was going on in people's understanding of where we stand, where we are in the world today, in that people were always seen as being against nature, and that Bill McKibben wrote a book called The End of Nature because of what humans were doing to the environment, and that became a really paramount book for many environmentalists and people concerned about the natural world. And then you had another culture, if you will, of people who say that, oh, we'll be able to innovate our way out of anything and everything. And I think both of them had, both camps, if you will, had a view of nature that was quite at odds with what our understanding is from the environmental sciences, that there is a natural environmental dynamic to the planet. The preservationists, if you will, that we need to preserve things, we're counting upon the idea that there was an original stable state and humans were altering it. And others on what I called the culture of growth were having the assumption that, we'll be able to kind of control nature. And we've never been able to do that. We can manage certain aspects of it, but what human capabilities of altering the world, the distribution of water over the landscape, the nature of the atmosphere, and the nature of the oceans, so many aspects of the world's biota and the exchange of species across the planet, that what we have done is that we are touching the same strings of instability that have defined some of the greatest challenges in our own evolutionary history, going back through time. But we're a totally new factor. It's an experiment that has never been run. And so my own thinking is that I've been able to, in my own mind, understand how humanness and that capacity to change, to alter things, arose as part of the emergence of adaptability. but how that now leads to an experiment that has never been tried before and is leading to certain rates of change in the atmosphere, for example, that are unprecedented in the history of our species and in the last 6 million years since the first human ancestors evolved. And that presents, I think, one of the most interesting survival challenges. And that's really what my comments at the end about are we it, is that it's not just a matter of humans are inevitable and we're around forever, but that the understanding of human evolution absolutely demands a sense of responsibility about who we are and what we do in the world today.
Last question?
Yeah, my name is Al Ehrlich, and I am a member of the Society. And my question goes to the Neanderthal story, as well as the non-finding of the Neanderthals in the genome. No echo of Neanderthals, as you put it. First of all, humans presumably were, as I read it, reduced in number in the bottleneck situation in southern Africa, in South Africa, because of desertification of northern Africa?
Yeah, there's some discussion about whether it was eastern or southern, but
Okay.
yeah.
What was happening to the European climate, and was there a crash in the Neanderthal population?
Yeah, that's a really good question, in that what we know about Neanderthals is that as adapting less culturally but more physically to temperature changes, that whenever there was an ice age, that we find Neanderthal archaeological sites, what are called Mousterian tools, that tend to go closer into Iberia and into Italy. So a southern migration, and then they would repopulate. And so what we see, starting at about 55 to 65,000 years ago, up through the extinction of Neanderthals, about 30,000 years ago, is high fluctuation in ice age conditions. They were able to adapt through that one strategy that I called move. The problem is that during one of those times, about 45,000 to 46,000 years ago, the move strategy, during that move strategy, Homo sapiens moved into Europe.
I see.
There is no evidence of any physical conflict, no evidence of mating, no evidence. We don't know how much interaction there was. There are no killing fields of Neanderthals. That seems to be a phenomenon of Homo sapiens history, not of our prehistory. And what we can now say is that probably there was an avoidance of competition, and Neanderthals, we know that they had a fairly slow rate of growth and therefore of reproduction, and just a very minor difference in reproductive rate could have led to Homo sapiens really outcompeting Neanderthals everywhere.
Well, I thought there was a notion that maybe there were simply so many more humans than Neanderthals that their DNA got very diluted simply by numbers rather than competition or slaughter.
Yeah, but in terms of the evidence from the Neanderthal Genome Project, there is no evidence of any kind of interbreeding that occurred. So it's not a matter of swamping out genetically. Even the amount of DNA that occurs in non-African humans today, they haven't really come up with an estimate of the number of matings, but it could have been very, very small because it was occurring in a population, Homo sapiens, that was expanding very rapidly. And therefore, the amplification, if you will, of Neanderthal DNA gets up to about 2% on average in non-African humans. But that could have arisen from a very small number of matings.
And not the idea that Neanderthal would occasionally join a human group, but a human would not join a Neanderthal group, which would conceivably explain no human DNA in Neanderthals, but a little bit in humans. That's an alternative explanation.
It could be. It could be.
I'm
And
just suggesting.
that's the really interesting thing about the whole matter of paleogenomics and your question, is that it is such a new field. And there's going to be tons of new information coming out. One thing I would mention to you is that on March 25th, that Dr. Svante Pääbo, who is the leader of the Neanderthal Genome Project, is giving a talk at the Smithsonian in the invitation of the Human Origins Program. And so go onto the Smithsonian Associates website if you're interested in following up on it.
I belong, actually. Thank you.
Great.
Plenty of time for further discussion, but we're going to hold off on any further questions right now. And we're going to thank Rick for giving a wonderful talk and showing us some beautiful science. And as a small token of appreciation, I'm presenting Rick with this plaque, which is the announcement of his talk signed by members of the General Committee. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Larry. Really appreciate it, and thanks to all of you. Appreciate it very much.
I have a few more things.